Welcome to the On Wonder podcast. We're here in series 9, talking about neurodiversity in education and life. I'm Sarah Kinsella.
And I'm Brenda Del Monte.
And today we're joined by Emily Kircher-Morris, and we're so excited to have Emily on because she co-authored a book, The Neurodiversity Affirming Schools, Transforming Practices so all students feel accepted and supported. We're really excited about this book, and we're doing a book study on it with the Special Ed Tech Center. So who better to have join us today to talk about neurodiversity than Emily? Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Absolutely.
Yeah. Emily, you're a mental health professional.
Correct.
And you have your own podcast.
I do.
Neurodiversity Podcast. So tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah. So I started my career in education. I was a classroom teacher, and then I actually worked for a while in gifted education. That's my first master's was in education with a certification in gifted ed. But what I really found there were a lot of twice exceptional kids. So just in case anyone doesn't know that term, twice exceptional means somebody who is cognitively gifted and then has another disability layered on top of that. Autism happens quite often, ADHD, those are two that we see. Sometimes it can be a learning disability like dyslexia. So I really loved working with those students who kind of had those diverse needs. So I got a second master's in counseling, worked for a while as a school counselor, which was great because it gave me a lot of experience working with students who were more primarily identified and receive special education services. So I worked a lot with kids with IEPs and 504s. And then I gradually moved into my counseling practice. So I now work in the community in a clinical mental health practice where I support neurodivergent kids. And so, yeah, I've written a couple of different books. The one that you mentioned is the most recent. And I'm also the host of the Neurodiversity Podcast, which is great because, as you know, it's like I get to call up a bunch of people and say, can I just talk to you for a little bit? And so, yeah, all of those experiences have kind of led me to this work. And so, I'm just really, really passionate about it. I always mention too, so I'm neurodivergent. Like I was actually diagnosed with ADHD when I was a kid. And so for women in my age bracket, like that's not something that happened very often, but my mom was a special education teacher. And so she was really advocating for me. And so that also, of course, influences all of the work that I do as well.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. And
yeah.
Am I right? You have children of your own?
I do. I've got 3 kids. They are almost 8. We're just like everyone's birthdays are kind of around the same time. So we're almost 18, almost 16, and almost 11. And so within the next 2 months, everyone's going to kind of age up here. So my oldest is getting ready to go on to college next year and trying to navigate all of that. And so, and then my youngest is going to be in middle school. So we're going to be done with the elementary school that we've been at for years and years.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
I love that you have so many pieces to your background, right? So being a parent, the working in the schools, your own experiences personally, your mom was in special ed. I love that. All those things just really help us have a better understanding of.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I look back actually on my experiences when I first started teaching. And honestly, even when I first started counseling, when I first started my counseling practice, my 2 older kids were young. And I remember people would come to me and want to talk to me about like parenting advice. And I did what I could. I was aware of the fact that I had not ever lived through some of those things, and it does shift so much. Like I look back, I'm like, why did anybody listen to anything I was saying? But yeah, it's I think having all of those experiences, I think especially having the blend of the counseling in the community as well as the work in the schools is important because so often, like I know when I worked as a school counselor, families would come in with a prescription from a therapist or a doctor and say, oh, well, they need an IEP. It's like, well, that's not how that system, that's not how that works. And vice versa, sometimes, and I think sometimes there's this disconnect. So being able to pull from both of those places, I think has been really helpful for the work that I do.
So how do you define neurodiversity?
Yeah. So it's interesting, actually, when you think about neurodiversity, there really are honestly some competing definitions out there about how people understand and conceptualize this. And I don't know, for people who are very online in the neurodiversity community, you frequently see these conversations going. I will tell you that when Amanda and I wrote Neurodiversity Affirming Schools, we did have to kind of define specifically what we meant when we were talking about who is neurodivergent. So neurodiversity, of course, is just the variability between brains. It's like a parallel to the idea of biodiversity, right? We all have these different traits, these different skills, these different ways that we think and process and communicate. And that is good, in general, to have this variability with how people show up. When we think about who specifically is neurodivergent, some people would say this includes anybody whose brain diverges from the norm. And I can get behind that to some extent. But they include things like what we typically talk about, autism, ADHD. I think those are the ones that come to mind first, but also includes things like, Tourette's or epilepsy. But then also that gets really broadened to, things that I would personally consider, like I would label them a little bit more aligned with psychological or mental health diagnoses, like anxiety and depression. OCD is kind of a funky one. It kind of fits in a little bit of both. So I'm cautious with I don't set super hard parameters around this. However, when I think about neurodivergent learners specifically in the schools and how we approach and what we mean by being neurodiversity affirming, that really does shift a little bit. So when I think about who is neurodivergent as far as what we're doing in the schools, I do tend to limit it to things that are pervasive, things that are probably lifelong, things that influence how somebody thinks and processes information and learns and communicates. And some of those labels, while they definitely might influence those things and they might need, you might even need accommodations for some of those things, I'm a little bit cautious about that because we approach them differently. So when I think about, for example, being neurodiversity affirming, which is kind of the premise of what a lot of the work that I do, that shifts based on what label somebody has. So for example, if I have a client who comes to my office and they are primarily coming to me because they are dealing with anxiety, my goal is to make that anxiety go away. Anxiety can be episodic, it can be treated, whether that's through therapy or medication. And hopefully we are going to develop skills and strategies and resources in order to minimize or even eliminate that anxiety. Like that is the treatment goal that we use. When I have a client who comes to my office and they are autistic, my goal is not to make the autism go away. My goal is to affirm who they are, to understand what their neurotype, how their neurotype influences how they show up in the world, and then help them figure out a way to navigate a world that wasn't created with them in mind. And that to me is different. And so that's kind of where I get a little bit cautious, because realistically, with things like, for example, anxiety, you could be affirming to the person and their experiences, but if you are affirming to the quote unquote anxiety, often what you actually do is you make it worse. If you accommodate anxiety too much, it makes it, it magnifies it. It makes more, it makes it, yes. And so, but we can always recognize, of course, there's lots of overlap between all of these things. So I think I kind of always go back to, when I think about who is neurodivergent, I think of, again, who are the people who really are influenced by their neurotype and how they show up in the world. And then how do we approach the way that we support them in a way that doesn't try to change them or shift who they are, but meet them where they are and find those solutions.
So you're making me think about, in schools, you're making me think about universal design for learning and how, if we design this way from the beginning so that we're neurodiversity affirming, or we have things set in place for all students, right? Then it's not a student comes along and, oh, you might need this or that, let's figure this out, right? But you're also saying it's important to know about our students, right? The labels are important, and to know.
Yeah, labels are, so I would also define myself as somebody who is very pragmatic and realistic about what's really happening. So there are conversations that will often happen and people will talk about like, well, we shouldn't have to make accommodations. The world should just be accommodating, meaning like things are set up in a way. I'm like, well, that's fine and good. However, that's not reality right now. Like if you are in the schools and you need accommodations, to be fair, you can get a 504 without an official label or diagnosis, right? That is legally true. However, if you're going to get an IEP, you have to have some sort of identification through, the IEP process. In general, having a diagnosis, if you're seeking a 504, can be helpful in those ways. And additionally, the label and the identification helps us to figure out how to support those kids. So for example, if I have somebody who comes to my office and they're struggling with social relationships, whatever that might be. If they are autistic versus ADHD, I might approach those things differently because what's causing some of those struggles might have a different cause, a different thing that's going on. So I might try to find different solutions for that. Do you have to have a label? Not necessarily. But when we think about universal design, absolutely, we can put systems in place in our schools that are not only good for neurodivergent kids, but are good for all kids. And that can help minimize the need for some of those labels and some of those identifications. But also there are times when we need both, for sure.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of those systems that we can put in place in schools?
So I think a big part of what influences this, a lot of it is about how teachers approach learning about and talking to their students. Like there are things in the school that you can do when we think about universal design, for example, like giving options on ways students can show their learning and recognizing that it doesn't necessarily have to be just because things have been done in a certain way for years and years and years doesn't mean that that's how they always have to be done. So one of the big questions that I always encourage educators to ask when they're thinking about accommodations or they're trying to come up with a universal design strategy or system to put into place is to reflect on what is the objective that you are actually asking a student to show that they can do. So for example, there are a lot of neurodivergent learners who don't always work really well in groups for a variety of reasons. Sometimes you have kids who struggle with processing speed, for example. And so then if they're working in a group, even if they are able to usually share their thoughts verbally, they maybe just need more time to put those thoughts into those words to be able to share that. But sometimes that conversation goes so quickly that that by the time that person has those thoughts in place, like the conversation has already moved on. There might be social anxiety. There might be like there could be lots of different things there. And so sometimes teachers will say, oh, well, we're going to do this group project. And a kid will say, well, can I just work by myself? And they'll say, no, everyone's working in a group. Well, why? What is the objective of that actual lesson? And so, for example, there might be times when the actual objective of a lesson, it might be part of the curriculum to be able to collaborate with peers, like to be able to communicate and share ideas, like that might be part of what you're actually measuring there. But if it's not, if it's just something that you're doing because you thought it would be fun for the kids to work in a group on this thing and somebody wants to work on their own, then we should allow that. Like there shouldn't be a barrier to that. And so I think that when we offer those opportunities for teachers to reflect and be flexible about things, I think that really is a foundational piece of what it means to be neuroaffirming in the schools. You know, there are others. I don't know. I don't want to get too far off track from your question either.
That's a good example.
Right now, though, it sounds like you're talking about people that are able to be mainstreamed most of their day.
Yes. Yeah, okay. For sure.
So if we were looking at, I know I just did a consultation of a special ed teacher who throwing up her hands and feeling burnt out and freaking out because she's got a lot of kids. I think most of them were autism level 3. And I don't know if you want to talk about levels or not, but so one person's STEM triggers another person's issue, and the reality is that there's 14 or 15 of them in a room, and there's 2 paras or something. And so what does neurodiversity in the schools look like when we've decided to create that placement? What do we do around those kinds of things where one person's need to stim in one way triggers another person's system? Or so, because I feel like that's a question that we get a lot in consultations.
So I think one of the things to remember is that the first thing that we need to do is make sure that we are not treating it as a discipline issue. Like if you're trying to find with a student a different way that they can perhaps meet that sensory need, and then they default back to whatever that automatic stim might be, sometimes it can feel willful. It can feel like I've told you not to do this, or you know how not to do this. Sometimes you can do this and sometimes you can't. And so then if we treat it like it's a discipline issue, that's not, effective because you're not
Right.
like, this is something about how that student's brain works. When we talk about stimming specifically, the reasons people will talk about stims as if they are purposeless, right? And they
Right.
very rarely are purposeless. Usually it is something that is in place that that student is using to self-regulate their emotions, to sometimes regulate their focus and their attention. And so, but you're right though that there are times when those things are in conflict. So
Mm-hmm.
I have a peer who I know who sometimes jokes about this, and he will say sometimes the thing about accommodations and about stims and sensory needs is that sometimes everybody just needs to be mutually inconvenienced a little bit. And so sometimes that student has to try to suppress some of those things. And yeah, you could call that masking. You could call, but sometimes that student has to be able to tolerate some things, but we're in a community, and that is what it is like in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So the way that I usually approach this though is like, if a student has a sensory need and we don't have the opportunity to really have physical distance where it's not impacting other students, I just try to brainstorm like, are there ways that we can meet that sensory need in a less disruptive way? That's hard. It's like I say that and it's easy. For example, I think one of the hardest is when you have kids who have vocal stims, because I think like lots of movement things, we have lots of things like you'll notice as I'm sitting here on this chair, I swing in my chair quite a bit. Like that's one of my, if I'm not swinging in my chair, if I'm standing, I'm probably rocking back and forth. Like that's just how my body tends to move. Luckily, that's not one that usually bothers people too much. But like vocal stems or like whether it's throat clearing or whatever, when it's auditory, and that's a hard one because it's not as easy to substitute. Like sometimes I feel like if they can have a piece of candy or a piece of gum or something else like for that oral, stimulation, like that could be a possible solution. But then sometimes it's like, okay, well, are there ways that we can help those other students avoid those triggers as well? But it's hard, especially when you are talking about students who maybe are at that level 3, who perhaps maybe are not really easily able to articulate what their needs
Right.
or their dysregulation is about. I just encourage educators to feel comfortable enough to try to be flexible about finding different ways that would work for each individual student, because it is just so unique, and just recognizing like there's not just a perfect solution, unfortunately,
Right.
always.
So high level, can you explain the levels?
Sure, absolutely. So I think the easiest way to do this is when we think of level 1 autism, that's the lowest level of support needs, is the way that
Okay.
it is worded in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So this is not a perfect comparison, but I would say a lot of times a level 1 autism is what we would have maybe called Asperger's in the past, when that was still part of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So just in case anyone isn't really familiar with this, in the DSM-4, which we had up until 2013, we had Asperger's, and then we had autism, and then we had like pervasive developmental disorder, right? And so then in 2013, everything was rolled together into this autism spectrum disorder. And really the only difference between Asperger's and autism, as they did the research and revised that diagnostic criteria, the main difference was that autism had a language delay in early childhood. So maybe that regression of language, or maybe they just really didn't begin to speak at a young age. Whereas a lot of times the kids who fit under that Asperger's title didn't have that. They might have even experienced like and shown hyperlexia, where they were even early readers and could talk. But ultimately what they realize is that there still is a language impact there. There's still a language impact. And so that's why they kind of put all of that together.
Okay.
So that's probably the easiest way to think about level 1. Like these are individuals who probably really struggle with, social communication stuff, like understanding the hidden social rules. They might be very literal and struggle with figurative language. We used to also call this quote unquote high functioning autism, which is not a term that's very affirming. We really don't use that term any longer. But primarily what that meant was that somebody who had intelligence, at least as we can measure it, in the like average to above average range. And so that's a general way to do this. Level 2 has some more significant impacts. I would say in general, these tend to be people who have who are able to use language, perhaps not always. It's kind of, again, is that middle range there, right? But are struggling more, need more supports, need, as far as like maybe employment and those types of things, maybe need a little bit more structure. And then level 3 is what we're talking about with much more significant disabilities, probably a lot of motor apraxia. They probably maybe, non-speaking. And so that's kind of a broad way of looking at it. So like people who are identified with the level 3 autism, they have just very high support needs. They probably need care throughout the day, and may not ever really be living independently, on their own. So, I think also I'm sure that people who are listening are familiar with the conversations about kind of separating out some of those labels and talking about like a label specifically for profound autism versus those others. It gets complicated. I don't know that I have a great solution for that, but
for sure.
Yeah, and I think it is confusing. And I understand why it's hard for people to kind of conceptualize all of those differences. But, it's because you support all of those things so differently. Yeah. But there can be fluctuation as well. Whereas in some environments, somebody might be level 1 or level 2. It's not always like, it's not as clean as it maybe sounds when you say level 1, level 2, level 3. Like that sounds very neat and tidy, and it's not always that easy.
No, right. But it's kind of like the tiered system in the schools too, right? Mm-hmm. There's some gray for sure. In Arizona, we have a lot of people that opt out of public education at that autism level 3, and they go to either an ABA school. I say that because they're not on an IEP. There's not always a teacher, but it does mean that there's a lot of adult to child one-to-one. I'm wondering what I'm hearing from parents when I do communication device evaluations in that setting is that even though they're in a room with a lot of children, their primary communication partner is an adult, and the adult is maybe following them around with a tablet of some kind and hoping that they touch something. And so it seems like I'm wondering, I'm hearing the public schools saying, this is a really tricky thing. We don't have the staff. We don't know how to not have this have kids trigger other kids picking up behaviors from other kids. Sometimes that's true, sometimes that's not, right? I mean, there's fear around that, and sometimes that's not the reality. So what do you think? Do you think that there's space for all of this in education, or do you think that we should be educating all children in a certain way as far as environment goes, setting goes?
I think I'm hesitant to anytime say that there's one solution for any individual student or situation.
What is the goal in the setting?
Yeah. We did a really interesting episode on the podcast with Tim Viejas, who works with the Maryland Coalition for Inclusive Education. And I was talking to him about the idea of like mainstreaming and inclusion and like, what does that really look like? And I thought he had some really good insights into recognizing that inclusion doesn't necessarily mean throwing kids into the general education classroom setting with or without an aid. Like that's not really what that means. And we can recognize like, when we think about least restrictive environments within an IEP, people think that means like, I think some people think that means that students should be placed as much in the general education setting with their same age peers as much as possible. But that's not actually necessarily least restrictive. The least restrictive is about their learning that's taking place. What is the place where they're able to best learn and accomplish their goals? And so I think that that's something that is has to be kind of carefully considered. But it is interesting when you mention this. I know Arizona has some interesting laws about vouchers and different things. I've done some work with some different schools in the area, and it's kind of like the wild, wild west with wherever
Completely.
teachers
Completely.
or wherever kids end up. And so, you know, but I do think that there are ways that public schools could be more flexible with some of that stuff, that we could find some ways to make it work for students, because ultimately, while the schools may not have an opportunity to have a one-on-one aid all the time, there maybe are solutions that could be really good fits, because sometimes public schools, hopefully they have some more resources that might be available that some of those smaller settings might not. And I do think it's interesting when you mention that they might be in a setting where they're getting a lot of ABA services, but what does that really mean as far as some of the other content, curriculum, goals, other things that are going on?
And opportunity to have social interaction with peers and all that. You're making me think about, so in Washington State, we're part of our Inclusive Practices Technical Assistance Network for the state. And sometimes what we hear when we're doing this work is about behaviors. And it made me think of something you talk about in the book, like rethinking behaviors. And I think you've talked about this on your podcast probably multiple times. But one I was listening to was like the idea of child-led. And can you talk a little bit about that idea of rethinking behaviors? We kind of mentioned it a little bit before, but just go into that, because that seems to be a big topic.
And I think what goes on with that is if we focus on behaviors, are we just focusing on compliance?
Absolutely.
So kind of like, what does how does that all come together?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think I think that's part of what is tricky about this is that, well, let me maybe approach this topic in this way. One of the other things we talk about, and I don't know if it's in that chapter or not, it might be, I can't remember. I did write a book, but it's all kind of mushy in my brain a little bit. But we talk also about the difference between teaching social skills versus teaching social navigation strategies or social acuity. Okay. And to me, those are different things, because oftentimes, and I think historically, when we have taught social skills, we are teaching scripts. We are teaching, when somebody approaches you, you look them in the eye, you reach out and shake their hand, and like, this is what is expected behavior versus unexpected behavior. And social navigation, though, on the other hand, really tries to focus more on the cognitive flexibility, like the possible solution. So it's not just like one solution, and then how do you then approach that in a way that feels right, to you. Again, when we have, one of the things that I go back to is like, and again, this is going to be more with students who, are speaking, but we think about like eye contact, for example, right? Like, how many autistic kids have been trained to make eye contact as a social skill? Like, I would much rather somebody be able to walk into a situation, and if they're able to advocate for themselves, say, it's actually much easier for me to focus on what you're saying while I'm looking at the floor, rather than looking at your face, or however they're going to communicate that in that particular way, as opposed to this insistence that you are looking me in the eye. But they should also know there might be situations where they might want to be able to even fake making eye contact, right? Like, if they are going, say, to a job interview or some sort of situation, like, so the navigation is, when and how do I choose which of those things to do that fits for me personally? So going back to the question about the behavior piece, how often are students reprimanded for being disrespectful, for not looking at their teachers while they're talking to them? It's like, you're not making eye contact. And I think when we think about understanding behavior, we have to understand how somebody's neurotype influences what that behavior is. So we had a guest on the podcast a while ago who uses an assistive communication device. He types out on an iPad, and he is the first non-speaking autistic person to be admitted into MIT. And they didn't know that he could communicate at all until he was 11, which I'm sure probably the people who are listening to your podcast, like probably have some experience with situations like that. But he articulated the fact when, when I had asked him the question, he had typed out his response, about, I would have this quote unquote behavior and I would flop around on the floor and be upset, and they would get they were saying that I was having all this behavior, but how else was I supposed to communicate what it was that I wanted them to know? That I didn't like what was happening at that time, or that I wanted something different. And I think that that's the thing we have to go back to, is that when we look at things that are prescribed as far as those expected behaviors, and then we try to get kids to do those things because that's what society expects, we then fall into the trap of, if they're not doing that, then they're, being disrespectful or non-compliant or whatever term you want to use there, when really we need to try to figure out like what actually works for this student and understanding what is beneath that quote unquote behavior. Another example I think about so often is because there are kids who are so literal, right? Like where I struggle with, figurative language and understanding what people mean. And so then I react to something in a way based on my understanding of it. But then that reaction is interpreted as, again, defiance, being rude. I don't know, whatever it might be, when it's not taking into account how that person approached that situation in the first place.
I guess I'm thinking about a school visit I did recently, and there was a student who he was with a paraeducator, so they were doing something kind of one-on-one within the larger group setting. And he got up and went over to a bookshelf and started to kind of climb up onto it. And what was really neat about it was the paraeducator just followed over, realized what was happening, and said, "Oh, okay, he's needing he's needing that sensory piece and that physical push right now." And so they have they had an alternative of something he could push that was a little safer. So that kind of reminds me of what you're saying. Like, it's almost more like knowing what students might need, but then us, like you said earlier, really being flexible. Like, what is the point of this task based on what we're seeing what the student do? What is it possibly that student needs in that moment?
I know what you're saying, Sari, because I work with children with significant physical disabilities, a lot of cerebral palsy and visual impairment and things like that. And I always say, I wish I could spend 5 minutes in their bodies. I want to know how they experience the world. But I do communication device evaluations in the state of Arizona, and probably 80% or so are people that are 4, 5, 6 years old with autism. And so it's a huge percentage of kids getting communication devices right now. And I also would like 5 minutes in their bodies. I want to know what sounds sound like to them, what lights feel like to them, what their skin feels like when they're made to do things that are that doesn't feel natural to their bodies. And I recently called to schedule an evaluation, and it was a child who had been removed from the home, was in a group home due to some really significant behaviors that are violent. So for the safety of the children, the other children in the home, this was what was decided. And so she said, "By the way, he's not going to do anything if you make him sit." And I was like, "Well, you don't have to sit to communicate." So we would make him sit. She was like, "Well, that's why we stop speech therapy, because we just, if he has to sit, it's not going to work." And I thought, oh, interesting that we have prioritized sitting in the scenario that I've just told you.
Right.
We've decided that in order to receive therapy,
you have to be
this
able to
person
sit.
has to sit and still his whole body.
Yeah.
If he knew how to do that,
He would do it.
be here. Yeah, we wouldn't even be in this scenario.
Yeah.
So
does that benefit him?
No. And this is what you're saying, like, what is the goal? Tell me, and that's when you have to look at the adults and go, is your goal compliance that he will sit?
Right.
This 4-year-old or whatever. This particular person is not a 4-year-old, but you know what I mean? We hear it at pretty young ages. And I mean, I tell a story, and I've told it on this podcast before. My son never sits, ever. And he's in law school now, and he was never a sitter. In his paperwork, it said he needs to be in the back or the side. He's going to stand, and don't make him
Yep.
sit. It's not going to work.
Yep.
So, I mean, and so I have sympathy around this and empathy and understanding and all the things. But what would you say to that? Like, are we focusing on almost the wrong behavior compliance, and we miss the opportunities for learning?
Yeah. And I think the other thing that's so interesting too is that in that particular situation that you're mentioning, when you focus on sitting, for example, when the child is not able to communicate effectively,
Right.
you're doing it backwards. like if they were able to communicate more effectively, you might be able to actually figure out what it is about the sitting, or if there's a different solution. And it's so yes, it's like we just need to have opportunities to really reflect on those things in order, like, what is the big picture goal? What is the most important thing that we want to work on? And then how do we work around all this other stuff? Right? Because when you set the foundation, and when somebody feels safe, like they're not going to get in trouble, or they're not going to be asked to do things that are uncomfortable from a sensory perspective, you remove those barriers to get to those core pieces of what's actually going to help that student. And then you build from there. And I think, though, again, it goes back to this. And I think this is one of the reasons that Amanda and I wrote the book. There are so many ways that the things that we do in schools, we do because they're the way things have always been done, not necessarily because it's actually what's good for kids. And I alluded to this earlier, but I didn't say it in this specific way. But when we make a school that is neurodiversity affirming, it is not just good for neurodivergent kids, it is good for all kids, because all students have that variability. And so when we create an environment that is more inclusive, specifically for the kids who quote unquote need it, it increases the chances of the environment where all of the students are going to benefit from having that understanding, those opportunities, those options in those different ways.
Well said. So I wanted to have you talk a little bit about advocacy and self-advocacy, because you kind of alluded to that earlier. And I know it's important for us to be supporting kids to do that, no matter where, what, where they're learning or how they're learning. Can you talk about that a little bit, and maybe any strategies that you've used?
Yeah. So the biggest thing about advocacy, are you talking more specifically like self-advocacy for students as opposed to advocacy for, okay. Yeah. So here's how I always frame this when I'm working with educators or parents or anybody. I always ask them, I'm like, think about the last time you had to self-advocate for something. It probably felt a little uncomfortable. Most likely it was a situation where there was some sort of a power differential. Even if there wasn't a power differential, like, for example, like to a boss or to, whatever, anytime you're having to self-advocate, even if it's somebody who's more like a peer or a colleague, there is a power difference there, because you have to be vulnerable to ask for something, and you are kind of it's at their discretion whether or not they actually are going to, help you with whatever that thing is. And so we talk so much about self-advocacy, like, well, they just need to self-advocate. They just need to ask for help. They can offer a signal. They can do all these different things, but can they? And how do we make sure that we are not only encouraging, but like really opening the door for that self-advocacy? And, how are we checking in with students? How are we making it easy for them to self-advocate? How can we make sure that they feel like they're heard, even if we're not able to meet whatever that request might be?
Right.
And so when I think about this, though, I think about how do we scaffold that skill? And because self-advocacy can look like a lot of different things. It can look like a signal. It can look like a note. It can look like a text. It can look like it doesn't have to be a verbal request. I would like to do blah, 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 blah. I mean, maybe sometime we get there. Maybe it's about having somebody who's assisting writing a message. Maybe it's about having somebody go along with as that message is delivered, in whatever method that might be. Breaking it down, just like any other skill, like, what are the smallest incremental steps that we need to help that student build that independence in that way? And so when I work with folks, like, I think that that's the thing that we forget sometimes about self-advocacy. That's really important to remember about this. It's not as simple as just saying, well, you know how to ask for help, or whatever.
Right.
If they're not doing
Yeah.
it, how do we break it down for them?
And practice it in
And practice it.
real
Yes.
situations. Yeah.
Well, it is interesting that you say, you know how to ask for help. And I do think people think if I teach them how to touch the help button on the device, then they know how to self-advocate. Or if I do some social story in Pictello that says, when this happens, I say this script, and that's self-advocacy. And so it's interesting that you should say that, because I don't know that they even are always framing that help equals you working through this with me. I think we say help when you need to open something. I mean, you know what I'm saying? I think help is very, very,
Yeah. Well, you're right.
Depends on how we've been learned, but how we learned the word help, but it doesn't actually easily translate. Talk about concrete help versus abstract thinking.
Yes.
And that's absolutely a humongous leap, not to the adult that's working with them, but to the person who has learned help in a very concrete manner. Help does not even translate to self-advocacy.
Yeah.
I don't.
No, I totally agree. I think your idea there about concrete help versus abstract thinking, and recognizing that self-advocacy is a much broader idea than that. I think that's a really important point that people should remember. I totally agree with that.
So how do we begin to teach it?
Well, it kind of depends on where kids are and what are you seeing as far as the things where they need help. Are they able to indicate that they need strategies or support or help in certain environments? And then how do you then build from there? Like, what are the ways to generalize that to other environments or other situations? I think part of it is modeling it and labeling it. And so then, depending on a situation and depending on a student, I feel like sometimes a lot of students, especially who are neurodivergent, they tend to maybe be, well, I don't want to say tend to be, but they can be very black and white about being willing to ask for help. Like, they might really feel like, I should be able to do this thing, or I don't want to ask for help because it doesn't feel comfortable. And so really, like, sometimes putting it back on them, like when we're offering accommodations or tools, like labeling, like, what is it that we're doing here? Why are we doing this? Helping them understand what the process is there. So then in the future, if that's something that they're not getting, but they know would benefit them, how do they then communicate that? Like, it's all of these little micro moments day after day. But I think the other piece of it is, when a kid is self-advocating, how do we make sure that they know that they're heard, even if we're not able to do whatever that thing is? How do we help them problem solve through that? Because ultimately, the thing that will shut down self-advocacy more than anything is feeling like, well, I asked before and nobody helped out, so then why am I even bothering?
Right. You know, I think sometimes when I'm working with children who are non-speaking, and I'm reading their body language as they hover around an area, right, in a classroom, in a school. And you're like, I wonder if you're curious about that, if you want to be included in that, if there's something about this area of the room, or the music coming out of this classroom over here, or the lights and sounds of the art room that's drawing you there every time we take a break and walk through the hall and we go to that area, right? Some of it is just being better at observing the advocacy behaviors, for lack of a better word, that they are exhibiting, because then you can say, I'm wondering if because you're drawn to this area, if you have ideas around being included in this, if you have ways that you would like, questions you have about this. You know, I think that some of it is that you should see the schedules of these kids in their schools, like, and because they have movement breaks every 15 minutes, we have a 10-minute this and a 5-minute that and a 10-minute this, And do we have enough time for kids to explore and demonstrate that they have a need to advocate for, I'd like to be included in something different, or
Mhm.
I don't know if I'm articulating it quite right, but I think the observation of behavior can help us at least see the opportunities for self-advocacy and
Mhm.
instruction.
What this reminds me of, and it's a parallel, and I'm going to share it just because it reminds me of it. But so, like, as a mental health clinician, obviously, like, a lot of what I do is talk therapy, right? So, like, my clients primarily are able to speak and have okay, reciprocal communication, in different situations. It's not always as easy as others. But one of the things that they encourage you when you're in your training to become a therapist is about using open-ended questions. And I
Mhm.
remember when I first started really working with a lot of my neurodivergent clients, open-ended questions were like, what? I mean, we could sit there and stare at each other the whole session, and so, but like you said, so I started like using like just what are the patterns that I see, what are the observations that I see, and kind of trying to then articulate those things for them.
Mhm.
And I'm cautious about, like, I don't always want to do like rapid fire, like, is it this? Is it this? Is it this? Is it this?
Mhm.
Because that isn't really effective either.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But it's kind of the same thing where it's like if you have a student who is having a hard time finding their own words, how do we help them with that? And so,
Mhm.
but you're making those observations and then you're just kind of narrating what you're kind of
Mhm.
observing or what
Mhm.
options might be. And
Mhm.
then that is a stepping stone because then they have maybe, yes, that's the thing I want, or no, it isn't the thing I want.
Mhm.
Mhm.
That in and of itself is self-advocacy. Like that is
Mhm.
that is a form of self-advocacy. And so then how do we then build from there?
Mhm.
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 Love that. So, Emily, as we wrap up, Brenda and I wanted to ask you if you could plant one idea in every listener's mind about neurodiversity, what would it be?
I think sometimes we get into these spaces when we're supporting neurodivergent people and we see it as this binary. Some people see it as it's a disability. It's so impactful and it's very deficit based. Sometimes there are people who view it like, oh, it's a superpower and it's such a strength and I really believe it's important to recognize the both and of it.
Mhm.
There are unique traits that can be strengths, that can be part of somebody's personality, that can make them who they are, that you would never want to change. And also, they deserve support for the areas that are more difficult for them.
Mhm.
And so, I think when we approach it from that angle, we're able then to explore the strengths, find the opportunities for strengths-based supports to build on those things, while also recognizing like, yeah, there are obviously things that are really hard here, and how do we build in those particular areas to help them achieve whatever their goals are, whatever their personal drive leads them to.
I love that. I love that. Yes, and both.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Supporting. And that's really getting at supporting that is very supportive, right?
Hmm.
You're
Yeah, I think sometimes, like I said, I think sometimes we just fall into that trap of one or the other,
Mhm.
and that just doesn't really help anybody.
Right.
Mhm. Mhm.
Well, thank you so much. It's been so interesting to have you talk about the self-advocacy, rethinking how we are looking at behaviors.
I feel like just your definition of
Yeah.
neurodiversity, and because we're actually
Yeah.
asking almost all of our guests to define it, and we have yet to come up with a single, like that everyone's defining it the same.
Yeah.
So to be fair, I think that even that is important, where it's like when not to be too flippant in the using the vocabulary. So when we say, when we're working with families, and it's like, okay, so when I'm talking about neurodiversity, I'm talking about this. It deserves a follow-up statement about this is how I'm looking at it in this context. And I really liked how you said when we're looking at anxiety, we're talking about giving you strategies to make it better. and different. And when we're looking at autism, we're looking at ways to affirm the way that you are. We are not looking to, quote, cure you. And I think that's a very easy way to delineate kind of the differences between people that, since we're all neurodiverse from each other, right, the broader sense, versus like, listen, we're not here to change who you are. We're here to support who you are.
Yes.
And I think that is a great way to look at neurodiversity in the schools.
I love that. Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a great conversation.
Yes. Your book's amazing.
Oh, thanks.
This podcast is produced by the Special Education Technology Center, administered by Central Washington University, and funded in part by OSPI. However, the content does not necessarily represent the policy of CWU and OSPI, and you should not assume endorsement by the state government.